The snow had been falling heavily for 3 straight days when Maria Miller stepped out of her house that morning. She didn't need to go out. The wood was chopped, the fire was lit, and the cold outside was 72 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that doesn't warn you, doesn't hurt, but simply turns you off. But there were the traps. The traps that Elias had set along the clearing years ago, and which Maria visited every week, not to hunt. She had never hunted again after he was gone, but because walking to them was the only way she had left to be with him. Her boots sank with every step. Her breath came out in thick clouds and vanished before reaching the pines. The silence of the wilderness that winter was different from all others. It was a silence that carried weight, that filled the ears like cotton, making any sound seem like a mistake. That was why she stopped. There was a sound, too low to be the wind, too irregular to be a branch. Maria stood still in the middle of the snow for 3-4 seconds, breath held, eyes scanning the clearing ahead. There, in the center of the clearing, nearly covered by the snow that had fallen overnight, was a small, dark shape. Maria moved forward slowly, one step, another, until she could see the markings. Faint spots on a tawny coat, covered in white, barely visible against the frozen ground. A cub, so small it could fit in her 2 arms, motionless. The chest, she looked closely, straining her eyes. The chest rose, fell. It rose again, slower. Maria knelt with difficulty, her knees protesting against the cold, and pulled the glove off her right hand. She touched her fingers to the cub's neck. She felt the almost non-existent warmth and a heartbeat as weak as the pulse of a candle about to go out. Then she saw it. On the cub's left ear, a natural triangular fold, as if the wilderness itself had marked that animal to be found. Maria looked around. There was no sign of a mother, no tracks of anything, only snow, pines, and the wind that was already beginning to pick up again. The Alaskan sun that day would not last more than 4 hours, and what no one could imagine, neither Maria nor the pines that witnessed it all in silence, was what that frozen cub would do for her months later on the darkest night of that winter. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now and turn on the bell. Every week, a new story that will remind you why it's worth believing in something greater than logic can explain. 3 weeks before that day, in some deep part of the bush where humans have no names for places, a mountain lion had given birth under a slanting rock that blocked the north wind. It was her second litter. She knew what to do. The cub was born small, even for the standards of its species, smaller than the clenched fist of an adult man, with eyes still closed and damp fur matted to its tiny body. She cleaned him with her tongue, slowly, without haste, as if the whole world could wait. And in that part of the wilderness, the world indeed waited. There were no hunters. There were no roads. There was only snow, ancient pines, and the low sound of the wind passing through the trunks like an ancient breath. In the first few days, the cub did nothing but nurse, sleep, and move in small, involuntary spasms while dreaming of whatever cougar cubs dream of when they haven't seen the world yet. The mother warmed him with her body. When the cold increased, she pulled him closer, pressing her warm belly against that spotted fur that still smelled of birth. It was a simple life. It was a complete life. On the 18th night, the snow fell in a different way. It wasn't a blizzard. It was a collapse. An accumulation of days on the slope above the rock gave way all at once, and the ground shook as if it had swallowed something it couldn't digest. The mother jumped aside by instinct, cub in her mouth, trying to reach firm ground. She made it. The cub slipped. In less than 40 seconds, a barrier of packed snow, broken trunks, and rocks separated the two. The mother stayed on the other side, motionless for a moment. Then she began to vocalize, a low guttural sound that was neither a roar nor a meow, but something between the two, a frequency that the wilderness absorbed without returning an answer. She walked along the barrier for hours. She smelled every inch. She tried to dig with her front paws until her bones ached. The barrier had no opening. On the other side, the cub had rolled into the open clearing. No rock, no shelter. Without the warmth of the mother's belly against his fur. only snow, and 72 degrees below zero descending on him like a lid. His only crime had been being born too small for the avalanche to respect. While the cub was losing heat in the clearing 2 miles away, Maria Miller was putting wood in the stove and opening the letter that Pete had left the week before. It was from Paul, the oldest son. Paul's handwriting had been the same since he was a child, large, slanted to the right, with a sense of hurry in every stroke. Mom, the winter is getting worse. The doctor said the arthritis will progress. We found an apartment in Anchorage, small but warm. You don't need to be alone in that place. Elias isn't there to take care of you anymore. Think of yourself for once. Maria folded the letter carefully and placed it on top of the others, in the drawer by the window, the same drawer where Elias kept the hunting maps that would never be used again. She looked out the window. The wilderness was there, the same as always, impassive, enormous, indifferent to what men write in letters. Paul didn't understand. None of them understood. Leaving that place wouldn't be changing an address. It would be amputating the part of herself that still remembered what it was like to have someone. Elias's marks were on every plank of that cabin, in the crack in the corner of the wall he had never fixed, in the smell of wood and tobacco that the blankets still held, in the traps scattered through the clearing that she visited every week, like someone visiting a grave that still breathes. 2 winters alone had taught Maria one thing. Solitude is not the absence of people. It is the absence of meaning. And as long as that cabin still had Elias's marks, she still had a place to look when the silence weighed too much. But on that day, as she went out to check the traps and the snow covered her tracks behind every step, the cub in the clearing had already stopped vocalizing. Not because he had given up, but because he didn't even have the energy for that anymore. The Alaskan sun was going down. And time, in that land that knows no mercy, never waits for someone to be ready to act. Maria stopped 10 feet from the cub and didn't move for a long time. Her mind was not blank. It was full of voices, of logic, of perfectly valid reasons to turn around and go home before the cold got worse. They were voices she knew well. Some had faces. Others had Paul's slanted handwriting. The first voice was the oldest. It was the practical voice, the voice that had survived decades of Alaskan winters without any romance. That voice said, "You are 74 years old. Your hands barely close in the morning. You can't carry this home without hurting yourself. And even if you make it, what will you do? You're not a vet. You don't have medicine. You have no way to call anyone." It was a voice with valid points. Maria knew that. The second voice had Paul's accent, but the argument belonged to all the children at once. "Mom, you're in no condition. You're already doing more than you should just by being alive in that place. This isn't your responsibility. This is nature. Nature takes care of itself." And there was a third part to this argument, unspoken in words but present in every letter, in every radio message. If you get hurt out there alone, no one will know until Pete shows up next week. It was also a voice with valid points. The third voice had no face or name. It was just a sensation, the accumulated exhaustion of 2 winters alone, of waking up every day to a silence that had no answer, of making coffee for 1 cup and sitting in the usual chair and looking at the empty chair next to it with a constancy that hurt more than any cold. This voice said nothing articulate. It just asked, softly, "What for?" Maria stood in the snow with these 3 voices inside her head and the motionless cub 10 feet from her. Then she tried the radio. She knew it was almost useless, but she tried. Static answered with that white hiss she had learned to hate. The nearest vet post was in Fairbanks. 60 miles of road that in winter wasn't a road, it was an intention. Even if someone answered, even if they wanted to help, there would be no way to arrive before nightfall. And night there was not a time of day. It was another dimension. She tried Pete next. No answer. He was probably halfway between 2 points equally distant from any utility at that moment. The whole world was 60 miles away, and none of them could do anything. Maria looked at the cub, looked at the pines, looked at the sky that was already beginning to turn that lead color, which in Alaska means Night is coming earlier than you expected. There was an indifference in the world at that moment that wasn't malice. It was worse than malice. It was absence. It was the kind of situation where no one is a villain because no one is there. Nature has no cruelty. It only has laws. And the law of that clearing said that a 3-week-old cub without external heat does not survive an Alaskan night. Period. No appeal, no recourse. Indifference didn't need a face to be devastating. It only needed time. And time was passing. Maria took a deep breath. Vapor came out of her mouth and vanished in the cold air. She thought of Elias, not in words, just the image of him, standing in that same clearing years ago, looking at her with that irritating calm she had loved her whole life. And when the last ray of sun disappeared between the pines, Maria was still standing there. But something inside her had stopped listening to the voices. The cold at that hour wasn't temperature. It was a presence. It was something that occupied space, that filled the lungs with every breath like fine sand, that made every movement slower, more costly, more improbable. Maria had known this cold since she was a child. She knew it doesn't warn you when it starts to win. It simply wins. She knelt near the cub and watched. The chest rose, fell, rose again, but the interval between one breath and the next was getting longer. Not much. Just enough for someone who was paying attention to notice. And Maria was paying attention with the kind of concentration that only comes from someone who has already been on their knees near something that was slipping away and could do nothing about it. She had been like that near Elias. In that last week, in that bed, in that silence that they both pretended was normal until they couldn't pretend anymore. She pushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time. She took off the other glove and held both bare hands in the 72 below zero air, just to feel more clearly what the cub was feeling. 3 seconds. 5. The cold entered her fingers like needles. She put the gloves back on, enough to understand. The cub was beyond shivering. When the body stops shivering in extreme cold, it's not because it has adapted. It's because it no longer has energy even for the most basic survival reflex. Maria knew this. Elias had taught her this about the animals they sometimes found injured in the bush. When they stop shivering, you have less time than you think. The wind picked up. The pines around the clearing swayed all at once, as if they agreed with something Maria still refused to accept. She looked at the bushes on the east side of the clearing. There was a noise that for a second made her heart race, because it sounded like movement, because it sounded like an answer, because it sounded like something was coming. Maria stood up with difficulty and took 2 steps in that direction. It was the wind, only the wind moving the dry branches with that friction that from a distance sounds like footsteps. She went back to the cub. He hadn't reacted to the noise. He hadn't moved an ear, hadn't contracted a muscle. He was in the same place, in the same position, with the snow slowly accumulating on his fur as if the clearing was already beginning to cover him. Maria looked at the sky. The lead color had turned dark purple at the edge of the horizon. There were less than 90 minutes left before total darkness. In Alaska, total darkness in winter is not a poetic expression. It is the temperature dropping another 10-15 degrees below what it already was. It is the point where even animals prepared for that cold seek shelter. She thought of the cabin, of the fire that was lit, of the distance, a quarter mile, maybe a bit more. With arthritis in her hands and a cub in her arms, in snow that deep it would be maybe 20 minutes of walking, maybe more. With breaks, with pain. The cub didn't move. Maria stayed in silence for a moment that seemed to last longer than it did. The only sound was the wind and her own breathing, rhythmic, visible, alive. Then she heard it. Not with her ears, with something deeper than her ears. It was a distant sound, from the other side of the snow and log barrier that closed the north side of the clearing. Low, grave, repeated at long intervals. It wasn't a howl, it wasn't a roar. It was something between the two. The kind of sound that isn't in the human vocabulary because humans never needed to create a word for it. It was the sound of a mother who hasn't given up, who is still on the other side, who is still waiting. Maria looked in the direction of the sound. There was nothing visible, only the barrier, only the pines, only the dark coming slowly through the corners of the clearing. She looked down at the cub. She bent her knees in the snow. Her joints protested in silence. That dull, constant pain that had become so familiar she almost didn't notice it anymore. She placed her gloved hands under the small, rigid body, and then, very softly, almost without meaning to, she said in English, "I hear her." Carrying a mountain lion cub the size of a fat cat shouldn't be difficult for most people. For Maria, at 74 with severe arthritis in both hands, it was the hardest thing she had done since she buried Elias. She walked slowly. Every step sank into the snow up to her knee, and with every step she had to redistribute her body weight not to fall, which meant slightly twisting her torso, which meant pressing her fingers more around the cub, which meant that familiar pain radiating from her knuckles to her wrists like thin, constant electric wires. She didn't stop, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that if she stopped, her legs would get cold, and starting again would be even harder. A quarter mile had never been so long. While she walked, her mind worked in the only way it knew, practically, without adornments. There was no vet, there was no medicine, there was the stove, there was the thickest blanket, there was water she could heat. There was her own body, which still produced heat, even if less than before, even if less than what was necessary for the task she was taking on without being asked. And there was a doubt she didn't say out loud, but that walked with her in the snow. What if it isn't enough? She thought of the children, thought of Paul with his slanted handwriting and always ready arguments, thought of the Anchorage proposal, the small but warm apartment, the life they imagined for her, a life without risk, without cold, without the possibility of falling in the snow a quarter mile from home carrying a newborn predator in her arthritic arms. They weren't wrong. That was the hardest part to admit. They weren't wrong. They were just looking at the wrong problem. Their problem was her safety. Her problem was the silence from within. Elias had understood that without her needing to explain. Once, years ago, when the winter had been so brutal that even the wolves came near the cabin seeking warmth, he had said something she kept without knowing she was going to need it. The wilderness gives back what we respect, not as payment, just because that's how it works. She hadn't completely understood at the time. She had smiled and continued peeling the potatoes. Now she understood a little more. She reached the cabin door and opened it with her elbow, without letting go of the cub. She went inside. The heat from the stove hit her like an open palm to the face, abrupt, immediate, welcome in a way that only extreme cold can make heat feel. She went straight to the bedroom, straight to the brown blanket folded at the end of the bed, Elias's blanket, the thickest one, the one that still held not his smell, but the memory of his smell, which for Maria was the same thing. She placed the cub on the blanket with the same care of someone placing something that could break at the touch. She stood watching for a second. He was so small. He was so completely at the mercy of everything. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said out loud, in the tone of someone speaking to someone who is no longer present, but who somehow can still hear. "But I know why I'm doing it." She went to the stove to add wood. And for the first time that day, her hands stopped hurting. Or maybe they still hurt, and she had simply stopped noticing. If this story touched something inside you, share it with someone who also needs to remember that kindness still exists. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from right now? Thousands of people are here at this moment. Many of them could be from your city. Tell me in the comments and discover who your neighbors are. The first night was the longest of Maria's life. Not because she didn't sleep, though she didn't, but because every minute had a specific weight, a different texture, and she lived each one with an attention she hadn't used since Elias's final days. She started with her hands. She warmed her own hands first, rubbed them together near the stove until she felt the tingling that means the blood has returned, until her fingers bent without that damp wood resistance that extreme cold leaves in the joints. Only then did she touch the cub. She knew, without anyone having taught her, that cold hands on a hypothermic body would do more harm than good. The cub was on Elias's blanket on the floor near the stove, close enough for the heat to reach, far enough not to dry him out. Maria knelt slowly, with that care of someone who has already learned that knees charge what the body owes, and began to work. She wrapped him, warmed him, pulled back the wool a bit to check his breathing, wrapped him again. The cub's chest rose and fell at intervals that were still too long to be reassuring, but there was a rhythm. There was a rhythm, and that was enough to continue. Maria ran her warmed fingers through the spotted fur with slow, uniform movements from the neck to the base of the tail. It wasn't affection. It was heat, applied with method. But her fingers didn't know the difference, and perhaps the cub didn't either. She heated water. Not hot, lukewarm, the temperature you test on your wrist, the temperature mothers use. She wetted the tip of a linen cloth that had belonged to Elias and touched the cub's lips with extreme care. The first time, nothing. The second time, the tongue moved, a tiny, almost imperceptible reflex, but present. Maria closed her eyes for a second. "So you're still here," she said softly. It wasn't a question. At 3 a.m, she went to the pantry and stood in front of the shelves for a time she couldn't measure. There was jerky, the last piece she had kept for the coming days, dark and tough as leather. She took it without hesitating, cut it into small fragments with Elias's knife, and put it all in a pot with water to soften in the heat of the stove. While she waited, she sat in the chair that was hers, and looked at the chair that had been his. It was the first time in 2 winters that she didn't feel the usual weight of that gaze. There was something else in the room now. Not a substitute. Nothing replaces anything. She knew that better than anyone. But there was a breath that wasn't hers. There was a living weight on Elias's blanket that wasn't a memory. It was a presence. When the meat was soft enough, she went back to the cub and offered it in tiny portions, on her fingertips. He didn't react on the first try, nor on the second. On the third, the nostrils moved, a fine movement, almost nothing, but the nostrils moved, and then the whole snout, and then, as slow as the dawn of that place, the mouth opened in response to the smell. Maria said nothing. She stayed completely still until he finished what he had taken, so as not to scare him. Near 4 a.m, she noticed the right front paw. It had shivered first, a fine, rapid tremor that ran through the whole limb like a current. Then it contracted. Then it stretched out, slowly, as if the cub were trying to reach something in a dream. It was the warmth arriving. It was the body remembering it knew how to function. Maria stayed watching that movement for a time she wouldn't have known how to describe if someone had asked. There was something in that small, involuntary gesture that was, at once, the simplest thing in the world, and the most extraordinary. A tiny body refusing the cold, a stubborn pulse insisting on continuing, a life that had been discarded by the avalanche, and by chance deciding, cell by cell, that it wasn't ready to go yet. When the sky began to lighten, that timid gray lightning of the Alaskan dawn in winter, which looks more like a suggestion of light than actual light, Maria stood up and went to the window. The clearing was there, covered in fresh snow. The pines were there, motionless as always. And at the edge of the clearing, standing between 2 trunks, was a large, motionless shadow that hadn't been there when the day ended. Broad in the shoulders, low in the center of gravity, with that specific stillness of large cats when they are not moving, not because they are resting, but because they are watching. Maria couldn't see the eyes from that distance, but she knew the eyes saw her. She and the mother mountain lion stayed like that for a while. The window between them, the snow between them, a whole abyss of species and instinct and world between them. And yet there was something that crossed all that, something that had no name in English or any other language, but that Maria felt with the clarity of someone who is no longer at an age to pretend they don't feel. She looked down at the cub on the blanket. She touched the triangular fold on the left ear, the same mark she had noticed in the clearing, the same she had touched with her glove before deciding. "Shadow," she said, testing the sound of the word in the silence of the cabin. It was the right name. She knew immediately. Then she went back to the chair, crossed her hands in her lap, and waited for the day to arrive, while outside the mother didn't move from her spot. What neither of them knew yet was how much that parallel vigil, one inside, one outside, separated by glass and cold and everything that made them impossible for each other, was just the beginning of something no logic in the world could explain. The following days were not sweet. They were real. And real, in that cabin 60 miles from anyone, meant a simple and demanding thing. Every problem had to be solved by Maria, with what Maria had, at the moment the problem appeared. No net. No support. No margin. On the first day, the wood would run out sooner than expected. Maria had calculated the stock for one person, for the heat of one body, for the stove lit at a moderate pace. But keeping Shadow warm required the stove running at a higher intensity and for more hours. She went to the pile outside and counted the logs with her eyes. She did the silent math that people who live alone learn to do without paper. It wasn't enough. The solution was brutal in its simplicity. She started sleeping on the floor, near the stove, with Shadow pressed against her chest under Elias's blanket. The heat of her own body replaced part of what the wood would spend. She slept less than 4 hours a night. She woke up with a stiff neck and locked hands, checked Shadow's breathing, added wood, and started again. She didn't complain out loud once. On the second day, Pete showed up on his weekly route and knocked on the door with the usual supplies. Maria opened it only enough to receive the package, blocking the view of the interior with her own body. Pete was a good man, but had a loose tongue, and the story of a 74-year-old widow housing a mountain lion cub would reach Fairbanks before the snow stopped falling, and from there it would reach the wrong ear, and from the wrong ear it would reach an authority with a form in hand. Pete looked at her with that expression of someone who notices something is different but doesn't know how to name it. "Are you all right, Maria?" "I'm tired," she answered. Which was the truth. It just wasn't the whole truth. He left the package and went away. Maria closed the door and stood in the dark of the hallway for a moment, listening to the truck engine vanish between the pines. Then she went back to Shadow. The third day was the hardest day. In the morning, Shadow refused food. He stayed apathetic, eyes half open with that vague expression that is neither sleep nor wakefulness, breathing shorter than it had been the day before. Maria stayed on her knees near him for hours, her hands passing warmth, her voice making that low, rhythmic sound she didn't know where she had learned, a kind of humming without melody, just frequency, just presence. In the middle of the afternoon, the letter arrived. Pete had left it in the package without mentioning it, as he always did when there was mail. It was a thick envelope. Maria recognized Paul's handwriting before even opening it, and inside was a letter. But there were also other papers, documents, with fields to sign, the formal proposal to sell the property, which the children had had prepared by a lawyer in Anchorage with the name embossed on the header. Maria read the letter, folded the documents, and placed them under Shadow, not on purpose, not as a symbolic gesture, but because it was the nearest flat surface and she needed her hands free to go back to warming the cub. Only later, at night, she looked at the scene, the lawyer's papers under a mountain lion cub sleeping on her dead husband's blanket, and stayed in silence for a while. Then she said, to no one in particular, Elias would have found this funny. On the fourth day, Shadow accepted water. A small amount, but he accepted. Maria let out the breath she seemed to have been holding since the day before. On the fifth day, Maria's hands reached the worst level of inflammation in months. The constant cold, the nights on the floor, the effort of carrying wood and supporting Shadow's weight during checks. It had all charged what it had the right to charge. She woke up with her fingers so swollen she couldn't close her right hand for almost an hour. She stayed still, looking at her own hand, doing the silent inventory that practical people do when the body starts showing its limits. Then she went to the shelf, took the jar of ointment she used in the hardest winters, applied it carefully, and wrapped her hands in wool cloth before resuming the day. There was no alternative but to continue. So she continued. The sixth day was the day that took 10 years off Maria at once. She had fallen asleep in the chair near the stove, a short, unintentional nap, the kind the body imposes when it no longer accepts negotiation. When she woke up, the blanket was empty. Shadow was gone. Maria swept every corner of the cabin with an urgency her joints didn't approve of. Under the bed, no. Behind the shelf? No. In the hallway? No. She had already reached the door, already put her hand on the knob, imagining the worst-case scenario. The door opened somehow, the snow, the cold, when she heard it, a small sound, behind the stove. Shadow was curled up in the narrow space between the stove and the wooden wall, the warmest place in the cabin, as he had discovered on his own. He looked at Maria with those yellow eyes that still had that expression of not knowing for sure if the world is trustworthy. Maria stood looking at him for a long moment. Then she did something she hadn't done in 2 winters. She laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh that came out before she could decide if it was appropriate. And when it was over, there was something different in the silence of the cabin, not the absence of weight, but a different quality of weight. Lighter, more breathable. On the 7th day, in the morning, Shadow stood up for the first time. Wobbly, back legs, still untrustworthy, the balance of someone discovering they have a body. But standing. Maria stayed completely still, sitting in the chair, without making any movement that could interrupt it. He stayed standing for maybe 15 seconds before sitting back down with the lack of ceremony specific to cubs of any species. But outside, at the edge of the clearing, the mother was in the same place as always. A bit closer than the day before. Only a few feet. But Maria had learned to measure that distance with precision, because she had learned it mattered. That night, for the first time in 7 days, she slept in the bed, and she didn't wake up once. 2 weeks later, Shadow weighed twice what he had weighed when Maria brought him inside. It wasn't that the thinness was gone. It was that specific fragility of something that can break, that lightness that isn't grace but an absence of substance. Now there was weight in his movements. There was intention. The paws that before trembled touching the floor now hit it with a growing confidence that Maria watched with the kind of attention one only dedicates to things that cost dearly. The fur had changed too. It was thicker, more alive. The dark spots on the tawny coat with a definition that the cold and hypothermia had erased. Maria sometimes saw him from behind as he explored the corners of the cabin, and thought it was impossible that this was the same animal she had carried from the clearing. Impossible that that small, limp form from before was the same creature that now knocked over the water bowl with his paw just to watch the reaction of the water spreading on the wooden floor. He had discovered curiosity, and curiosity in Shadow had no limit or common sense. He sniffed every inch of the cabin with the meticulousness of an inspector who distrusts everything. Sniffed Elias's boots that were still in the hallway. Sniffed the hunting maps still in the half-open drawer. Sniffed Maria's coat for so long she had to gently push him away before he decided the coat was his territory. He climbed Elias's chair, not all at once, but in progressive attempts over days, the first reaching only the height of the seat, the second managing to hoist himself, the third settling there with an expression of conquest that Maria found simultaneously irritating and irresistible. She never took him out of Elias's chair. She couldn't. There was something in that. Shadow in Elias's chair, looking at Maria with those deep yellow eyes that she didn't know how to name and didn't try to name. She just let it be. Some things don't need an explanation to be right. The bond had formed in a way Maria hadn't anticipated. It wasn't one moment. It was an accumulation. It was every night on the floor with him warming on her chest. It was every time she had said, "Quiet, you're here now in the dark." And he had stayed quieter, not because he understood the words, but because he understood the frequency. It was the morning she went to the stove, and Shadow got up and followed her, and then when she went to the hallway, he followed her, and when she stopped, he stopped, as if there were an invisible thread between the two that neither had consciously tied, but that was there nonetheless. When Pete showed up for the next weekly delivery, Maria opened the door a bit more than the time before. Not to show him, just because she was less tense, because there was something in that week that had relaxed a resistance she didn't even know she was maintaining. Pete saw Shadow through the gap in the door. He stood still with the supply box in his hand, looking. Then he looked at Maria. Then he looked back at Shadow, who had approached curiously and was sniffing the air in the direction of the box. "Maria Miller," Pete said with that voice of someone who is reformulating the sentence as they speak. "That's a mountain lion." "It's a cub," she corrected. as if the distinction were enough to end the matter. Pete stayed a moment longer, then handed over the box without asking any more questions. He was a man who had lived his whole life in the wilderness. He had learned early that things happen in the bush for which there is no right question. He went away without telling anyone, at least not yet. What had changed in Maria in those weeks wasn't visible to those who didn't know her, but it was there. She woke up before the sun, she always had, but now there was a reason that wasn't just habit or the insomnia of old age. There was shadow waiting. There was the ritual of checking the water bowl, of offering the meat she now supplemented with what Pete brought, of making that humming without melody while he ate. There was noise in the cabin. There was life in the cabin. And one morning, without warning, without anything specific having happened, Maria opened the drawer with the letters from the children and the sale proposal and looked at them with different eyes. Not the eyes from before, the eyes of someone being pressured, someone being convinced their life no longer made sense. Those eyes had gone somewhere between day one and that dawn. She took a piece of paper and a pen and wrote a response to Paul. Short. No arguments. Not on the defensive. She folded the paper and left it for Pete on his next visit. Then she went to the window, as she had done every morning since the first night. The mother was there, closer than ever, less than 100 feet from the window now, standing in the snow with that specific stillness Maria had already learned to read, not as a threat, but as language, as a deliberate presence, as a choice. Maria rested her hand on the cold glass of the window, and then, without having planned it, she said out loud, "Today." Because she knew. She didn't know how she knew. She knew the same way you know when a season is ending, not by any single sign, but by the sum of everything. She went to the door, opened it, and stood on the threshold. Shadow crossed the room slowly, past her, and stepped down the 2 entry steps with his paws in the snow for the first time. But what would happen in the following weeks would prove that that goodbye, that moment on the threshold that seemed like the end, was, in truth, only half the story. The mother moved forward slowly, not in a straight line, diagonally, with that caution of someone who had come that far by choice and not by impulse. Every step calculated in the snow, eyes fixed on the cub first, then on Maria, then on the cub again. Maria stayed completely still on the threshold. She had learned in those weeks that stillness is language, that staying still was the only thing she could offer that the mother could read without distrust. Shadow went to meet his mother with that still, unsteady step, back legs slightly out of sync, tail raised. When the two met, the mother ran her whole snout over his fur, neck, back, tail, with a thoroughness that was both inventory and affection. Shadow stayed quiet under that exam, as if he knew it was necessary. Then the mother raised her head and looked at Maria, directly, with those amber eyes that didn't blink, didn't look away, that had that specific depth of something that existed before any human word to describe it. Maria saw, in the dim light of that Alaskan dusk, the scar on the right side of the snout, ancient, thin, crossing the lighter fur around the mouth, the same one she had noted in the description she had built in her mind during all those mornings by the window, the same she had imagined so many times on the other side of the snow barrier. The two stayed like that for a time Maria couldn't have measured if she tried. Then the mother backed away, and Shadow went with her. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped once and looked back. Maria didn't know if it was instinct or memory or something with no name, but he looked. For a second, two. Then the two vanished among the pines, as if the forest had simply reabsorbed them. The weeks that followed were quiet. Solitude returned, but different. Not the solitude from before, the one that weighed like a solid thing inside the chest. It was a solitude that had space inside it, that breathed. Maria responded to Paul with another short letter. She didn't sign the documents, but this time she explained, in few words, why not. She didn't expect him to understand. She just needed him to know. During the worst blizzard of that winter, a blizzard the radio would later classify as exceptional for that region, Maria fell asleep in the usual chair, near the stove, with Elias's book open in her lap and the lamp lit on the side table. She didn't feel the lamp fall, She woke up with smoke. The corner wall already had low flames climbing the dry wood, the heat arriving before full consciousness. Maria stood up, disoriented, evaluating. The sand bucket Elias had left near the door for exactly that kind of emergency. The blanket, the window that wouldn't open from the outside in that winter. But before anything else, she heard it. Outside, in the middle of the blizzard, a cry. Urgent, repeated, with that low, specific frequency she had heard only once before, from the other side of a snow barrier on an afternoon that had changed everything. Maria put out the flames, with the bucket, with the blanket, with the hands that hurt and didn't stop. It took time. It took effort she didn't know she still had, but she put it out. Then she opened the door. Snow came in through the threshold. The wind came in. And 30 feet away in the clearing, standing in the blizzard as if the cold weren't something that concerned her, was the mother. With Shadow at her side, larger now, paws firmer, that triangular mark on the left ear Maria recognized before anything else. They both looked at her. Maria stayed still on the threshold with smoke at her back and snow on her feet and a heart beating harder than it had in years. The mother stayed motionless for a long moment. Then she turned, and the two vanished among the white pines without looking back. There was no witness. There was no record. There was no one to confirm or explain. There was only Maria, standing on the threshold, understanding in silence, with that certainty that needs no proof, what had just happened. She closed the door slowly. She stayed still in the dark for a long time, and then she smiled. The kind of smile that isn't just joy, it's recognition. It's the feeling that the universe sometimes, silently, without an audience, without applause, settles the score. There is a kind of kindness that doesn't need an audience to be real. It's not the kindness of photographed gestures, of stories told to get a response, of the good done while someone is watching. It's the kindness that happens 60 miles from any witness, on the threshold of a wooden cabin, with smoke at your back and snow on your feet and hurting hands and no one to see. This kindness is no less for not having a record. It is greater. It is the only kind the universe seems to recognize without needing to be called. Maria was 74, with severe arthritis, counted wood, and a solitude she had learned to carry as if it were part of her body. She had nothing the world considers a resource, and it was precisely her, not the system, not science, not those who had more, who knelt in the snow and placed a bare hand on the chest of something the cold had nearly extinguished, those who had much passed by. She who had little stayed. This isn't coincidence, it's character. When I think of this story, and I think of it often, on days when the world seems to demand too much and give back too little, what stays with me isn't the rescue. It's the silence afterward. Maria closing the door, alone, with no one to tell, with no proof of anything, just her and the quiet certainty that she did what was right. There is something in that silence that seems more valuable to me than any recognition. Kindness that doesn't need to be validated to be true. Gratitude that doesn't need words to be felt. Two completely separate worlds, joined by a single gesture that stayed engraved in a place no instrument reaches. Maria saved Shadow without expecting anything, and the wilderness in its way listened. And you, what would you have done in that clearing? With hands that hurt, with counted wood, 60 miles from any help. It's easy to answer from a distance. Harder is to answer when the cold is real and night is coming and the voices of logic make perfect sense. Don't abandon it. On the night Maria opened that door and saw the cat in the snow, there were no cameras. There were no witnesses. There was only her, standing on the threshold, with smoke at her back. The same woman who weeks before had taken off her glove in 72 below zero cold to feel if a pulse was still beating. The universe doesn't forget that kind of gesture. It never has. Even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching.